All right. Well, I have a couple thank yous to make first. First, thank you to the Bad Apple. I thought good teachers were rewarded good apples, but I guess I'm not a real teacher, but I will take it. I want to say thank you to Chicago for Chicagoans for hosting me. Great organization. And then I would like to thank all of you for being here. I'm really excited about this. This is a topic that's really near and dear to my heart. I think there's no better time to be talking about this, really, than February. Right now, we're experiencing kind of events around the country and the world, such as the Olympics, the Oscars, the Super Bowl, that all really talk about what patriotism is and what it means to signify American values. And I think that this is a really important topic to talk about when we're talking about American values, because anything in public policy is a reflection of not only what the government prioritizes, but what the people prioritize. And, I really don't think you can overemphasize power to the people. Everyone has a vote, and when you see voter suppression or what we just saw with the television host, people are scared about what it means to vote. And so I just want this to be an empowering story of what it means to be in the future as well. So, that did not go. So, because this is an American story, we really are going to go back to 1776 here. So, if you remember from your history books, there was no taxation without representation. People were pretty pissed about being taxed an exorbitant amount compared to what the British were, and they were not happy about it. So 1783, America officially gets west of the Appalachians, or at least the British ceded over to them. And for the first time in American history, there's this opportunity to massively expand west. Now, people are moving at a rapid clip to these places, but there's no place or way to tax these people. So even though there's this huge war about saying, well, people need to be represented if they're taxed, well, now you have people flooding into Ohio and Indiana and Illinois and Wisconsin and Michigan, and there's no one to govern them. And so just 4 years later in 1787, the Founding Fathers really came up with this huge federal policy called the Northwest Ordinance. And the Northwest Ordinance was really important because it made land surveyed in all these new Midwestern states. And for the sake of this story, that's important because it standardized land. It made it divisible and legible to distant buyers. So the idea being here that people could buy land before they even saw it. It would take days, if not weeks, to get here. And so people wanted to have a consistent, reliable way to purchase land. This really even manifests its way in Chicago. So there's the 6x6 mile townships and the 1x1 grids within those. And we see that even manifests itself today in Chicago. So North Avenue and Western Avenue are actually legacies of the 6x6 mile grid. And those were once municipal borders for Chicago. We see even today that the Cook County Western border was also a legacy of the Northwestern Ordinance of these 6x6. And it gets even crazier than that. If you look, I don't think the laser works on the TV, but if you look at downtown, you could see that even State and Madison was on that intersection of those 1x1 mile grids. And so we have, we see here that our grid system was fueled by selling and buying and mortgaging land without seeing it. And so Chicago was really the grand experiment of the Northwestern Ordinance in the late 18th century. And even though the inhabitants weren't here in the late 18th century, the land was already gridded before people were even occupying the space. So I can't get into all the reasons why Chicago saw an explosive population growth, but for the sake of the story, the population boomed, okay? We saw that Chicago was uniquely situated to be a new model for American cities. We saw this really structured around originally some raw exporting materials and distribution. And so just to give you a scale, in 1850, there were only 30,000 people in the city of Chicago. And I know Patty's going to tell me that, oh, well, you're not looking at the border expansions of the municipality of Chicago. Well, it doesn't matter, Patty, because a lot of people were moving here, no matter where you draw the line. 50 years later, in 1900, there were 1 million people. That is the fastest growing city the world had ever seen, ever. And so this created a huge demand shock. And so there was speculative building and informal density. And so I think this is a really cool slide. Well, I think they're all cool, but I think this slide's really cool because on the left here, you see this is the actual current zoning map for Chicago of industrial zones. And you can see how similar this was to what was available in the 1800s. And so a lot of it was revolved around the river, both North Branch and South Branch. And here you can see some of the common issues that we see. Child mortality, overcrowding, lack of sanitation, and my favorite, they used to map ignorance, apparently. So I wish we still did that, but so there's no government intervention yet in the 1800s. You're seeing a lot of people moving in, and basically it's this cycle that industry creates the jobs attract the workers crowd near the factories, and the overcrowding creates these health and safety crises, and there's really not much regulation or oversight or sanitation that's happening here. So we're seeing that policy is lagging, and so what is the consequence of this? Well, we see tenements. And I want to say something right now. I guess this is my first misconception. But tenements are often when people think of tenements, they think of New York's tenements. They think of higher-rise buildings. They think of really, really densely packed homes. And I want to stress that tenements actually should be perceived more as how housing functioned and not how it looked. And so, for example, in this photo on the left here, you can see it says a Chicago tenement area. And I was like, that church looks familiar. And I realized going on Google Earth, I was like, oh, that's Pilsen. And so a lot of these photos, or a lot of these homes, are actually still existing. So it wasn't that they were really, really densely packed kind of shanty towns that we think of that were like not up to code. The reality is that they were the same houses today. They were just subdivided like crazy. So you see 3, 4, 5, 6 families living in what now would be a single family home. And so tenements were essentially any building subdivided by multiple rental units, typically overcrowded, cheaply built or adapted with poor light, ventilation, and sanitation. And so, yes, in New York, this did solidify into an actual architectural form, but in Chicago, these were really just the wood frame construction that we see today. So I actually was in New York last month and I went and visited the New York Tenement Museum, and this is a photo on the left of what that looks like. And even though this is not in Chicago, it gives you a really good idea of what tenements look like. And you're like, oh, honestly, my first thought in Chicago, I was like, this is not that bad. But then I realized, oh no, this is a whole family living here. This is not just me. And so on the right is a photo of a very similarly sized room. It looks like from the photo it's in an attic of a family living there. And this is the near west side. So imagine where UIC is, near Halstead. So I want to read a quote by an incredible woman, and I'll get to her later. But a woman's simplest duty, one would say, is to keep her house clean and wholesome and to feed her children properly. Yet if she lives in a tenement house, as so many of my neighbors do, her basement will not be dry, her stairways will not be fireproof, her house will not be provided with sufficient windows to give light and air, nor will it be equipped with sanitary plumbing unless the Public Works Department sends inspectors who constantly insist that these elementary decencies be provided. Now, this was a quote from Jane Addams, and I'll get into Jane Addams a little bit later, but you have to understand how important she was in the civil rights and the social reform movement. She was a major advocate for women's suffrage. Let's say, give me another bit, I'll talk a little more. Well, I went on a camping trip in central Illinois, and I visited her home, and I thought it was so deeply ironic that the first woman to ever win a Nobel Peace Prize, the woman who co-founded the American Civil Liberties Union, her home that she grew up in near Rockford, Illinois, had a Trump sign on it. And I thought how deeply ironic it was. And it shows you that narratives are not preserved, history is not preserved, and homes are nothing if we don't tell stories about them. So it's important to keep that on, but we'll get to Jane Addams a little bit later. So I wanted to show you a couple photos of what tenements look like in Chicago. This is the near West Side. So this was really the dumping ground for most immigrants coming into Chicago. You have immigrants, mainly Germans, Bohemians, Polish, Italian, Russians, and Eastern European Jews. If you've heard of the Maxwell Street Market, the photo on the left is close to that. You see it's mostly dirt roads, and actually to some photos I'm going to show you, this actually looks pretty clean. But this is what a typical tenement district looked like. And it honestly looks like a lot of the streets in Chicago today. And it's because, like what I was saying, tenements were more about how the housing functioned, not how they looked. So if the near West Side was about just coming in and getting just your foot in the ground and being able to get your bearings, the South Branch was all about being close to jobs. Now, the industry structured around the rivers here, so coal, lumber, and grain were some of the biggest industries that started in Chicago. And so you actually see some tenements here that were for men only, a lot of men just working at these factories. But another example, the most extreme example of industries is back of the yards. This was actually, so these were both taken close to the Union stockyards today. And it just shows you how dirty the conditions were. Now, instead of the coal, lumber, and grain, the back of the yards were industries supported by meat. So tanning, soap, and fertilizer. A really fun fact I love about Chicago is that the company Wilson is from Chicago. And a lot of people don't know this, but Wilson actually gained its footing in the industry because it sold materials from the Union stockyards. And so if you think about tennis rackets, those were actually cow intestines that they would dry out and they would use as the rackets. If you think about the leather for the footballs, that was also from the cows from the Union stockyards. And so you see how Chicago is creating all these second order, third order economies that are all revolving around these raw materials. So this is a great example of why it was such a big issue being in tenements. So you see a lot of immigrants near the back of the yards here, and every dot you see here is actually a child mortality. And the gray area is immigrant areas. And so you could really see here how dominating the force was of just the unsanitary conditions and what it meant for the people living in them. And so here's a summary that I wanted to just say about kind of what the different kinds of tenement houses were. Now, how do we define public housing before there was policy intervention? This is, the way I'm defining it right now is really just the most readily available, always accessible housing. And that doesn't mean it's clean, it's sanitary, safe, we'll get there, but this kind of breaks down all the different types of tenements in the mid-1800s. And so another misconception here is that the market always provided housing. And yeah, they did, but at what cost? You know, the market really produced housing that was unsafe, unsanitary, overcrowded, and exploitative. And so before I really dive into the history of public housing, you know, kind of like what I was saying when I started was, well, what does policy mean? And everything in this presentation, when I talk about tenements, redlining, zoning, public housing, vouchers, LIHTC, they're all different answers to the same questions here: is who's allowed to live where, who decides, who pays, and what tools are used. So ironically, the actual first attempts to build housing for people that was safe and sanitary were from capitalists. George Pullman, in 1880, built Pullman, and he wanted this because he saw that when workers are living in these unsafe, unsanitary conditions, sometimes they can't get to work, sometimes they get sick, which is such a nuisance. So he realized, well, if I create a safe, sanitary environment for them, well, they can live here. And it was kind of his utopia of what cities should look like. There was a town square, there was a church where all different denominations could practice. If you haven't been to Pullman, I highly recommend going. It's such an amazing area. And, long story short, this didn't work out for many reasons, but the funniest one that I think is he thought it would be a really great idea to raise the rents and also cut the wages of his employees. Now, mind you, all of his employees paid the rent that he charged. So he didn't really think that one through, in my opinion. But so 9 years later, you see the first kind of social attempt to housing. Remember when I was talking about Jane Addams? Well, in 1889, she created the Whole House, which is a fantastic museum today, if you haven't been. And here we're seeing that the explicit intent was focused on light and air and sanitation. And they also provided a lot of social services, such as daycare, education, legal aid, and cultural programming. Now, these were funded through mostly private philanthropy, religious institutions, charitable foundations, and university affiliations. So who's been on my Westtown tour by any chance? All right, I got a couple of you. Nice. On that tour, I take you to the Northwestern Settlement. The Northwestern Settlement was built 2 years later in 1891. That is the longest continuing running settlement house in Chicago. And I don't want to say the country, but it might be the country. But it's old. It's really old. And you can see a couple of these, especially in immigrant neighborhoods. So Westtown, where I live, there's a couple. There's Northwestern Settlement. You have Chicago Commons. But you also have some on the south. You have the Henry Booth House, and you have the Hull House here. And so these were attempts to really provide housing. But the problem with these was that there really wasn't much housing available. Oh, if you're lucky, it's like winning the lottery to live in one of these things. But there's maybe at most 200, 300 units in a city that needs desperately more. And so your options are working for Pullman, winning the lottery, or living in tenements. And so we're seeing this bleeds into the 1890s and the 1900s. And in the 1910s, across America, we're seeing that maybe tenements aren't the best brand for America. They're unsanitary, they're dangerous, but most importantly, and the real reason why these were destroyed was political destabilization. So I don't know if any of you have seen, I think it's Gangs of New York, is that what it's called, the old movie? But I think about that a lot with this, is that, these were they were running their own ship in these tenements, and it was really hard to police, it was really hard to enforce order, and so a lot of policy saw that this was maybe very dangerous. Now, this also coincides with the Great Migration. So in the 1910s, there's these conversations of how cumbersome the tenements are, but we also see a lot of African Americans moving from the South. So between 1910 and the 1970s, we see more than 7 million African Americans leave the South to go to other parts of America, and this was largely defined by the rails. So, I'm from Southern California. A lot of the African Americans I grew up with trace their lineage from Louisiana and Texas, because they took the trains from Texas and Louisiana. In Chicago, you're going to get a lot of the Mississippi Delta, because the train of the city of New Orleans. So a lot of African Americans here can trace their lineages to Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana. And then on the eastern seaboard, people in New York and Boston and Baltimore, they trace a lot of their lineages from Georgia, the Carolinas, and Florida. But we see here that suddenly the narrative changes, because now it's not about containing. It really becomes an issue of race. And so when you see in newspapers of talking about the issues of tenements and the issues of slums and the issues of unsanitary conditions, you're seeing this dog whistle of containing populations. And you're starting to see that it's really more ambiguous of who those populations are. And when you really, what I think is really interesting from this chart on the right is that when you see the African American population growing, even in 1940 and 1950, you kind of see the total population plateauing, which, we talk about Chicago being a boom city, but that really kind of slowed down after 1920, 1930. And so what really was happening was that African Americans were becoming a bigger and bigger proportion of the total Chicago population. And that perceived invasion was actually just really a lot of people already leaving the city. But this also, the 1910s coincide with a landmark decision called Buchanan versus Worley. So just a couple states south of us in Kentucky and Louisville, there was a lawsuit that went all the way to the Supreme Court that ruled on that race-based occupancy laws violated property rights. So on the surface, this seems like a good thing, but in reality, it didn't prevent African Americans from occupying spaces from other loopholes. And so, So in the that's 1920, or that was 1917. So what really happens then, I'm going to start talking about zoning a little bit. And zoning originally was not explicitly racial, but we see that while you're not allowed to racially zone because of the 1917 law, you see, well, we're going to zone by land use instead. And so what you see now is, well, we're going to build certain kinds of homes. And mind you, this is before the 30-year mortgage. People can't afford, you have to put a big down payment down if you want a home. And so we see different kinds of single-family types, or actually multifamily types, pop up depending on the location. So workers' cottages were often in older industrial and immigrant districts, so Bridgeport, Back of the Yards, Pilsen, Ukrainian Village, McKinley Park. You have the bungalow belt, so in the middle, these bungalows went all over from the northwest and the south, so Portage Park, Jefferson Park, Belmont Craig, Irving Park, Chicago Lawn, West Lawn, South Shore, Avalon Park, Gage Park. And then you have 2 to 3 flats. That's kind of where we're at right now. You have kind of Lakeview, parts of Lincoln Park, Uptown, North Lawndale, Logan Square, parts of Bronzeville. And then you have courtyard apartments, 1910s, 1920s. These were really 5 to 7 miles north and south of downtown. So Uptown, Edgewater, Rogers Park, Kenwood, Hyde Park, Woodlawn. So Chicago is actually one of the first cities to embrace zoning. Before there's any national zoning, Chicago attempted to solve overcrowding by zoning. And so we saw some of the single-family homes here that was really being built. And we see here that this is really to, quote-unquote, control overcrowding. So this enters the national picture 3 years later in 1926. So regulating land use stopped being experimental. So if you've taken an urban planning class, you've probably learned about Euclid versus Ambler. And this was a really important lawsuit because basically what happened was Ambler Realty owned a bunch of lots in Euclid, Ohio, which is a suburb of Cleveland. And the city decided to zone it and that it restricted apartments, so multifamily and industrial uses. And Ambler Realty's argument was, well, you're actually destroying my property value and you're depriving me of my freedom to build on my own land. And he didn't win the case. And so that had enormous, enormous implications in federal policy that we see today. Because what that meant was that even though you can own property, the government gets to decide the use of that property. And so this effectively allows the government to police land use and change the use if it impacts public health and safety concerns, which conveniently the city also gets to define. So here's a chart from an academic paper I read in LA, which I really, really love because it's a supply and demand chart, but supply is defined as the population capacity. So it's not the actual population, which is the orange line, but it's the amount of buildings that can be built with the current zoning. You can see once zoning is implemented, basically we are built out to what is possible to build today. There is and part of the big reason why we're in such a housing crisis is because it's illegal to build in most areas. I'll show you a slide later, but 70% of Chicago today is zoned for single-family detached homes. So, yeah, it's a pretty big deal. So we don't have any, this was the first direct policy intervention when it comes to housing. But we don't see any actual housing being built. We're still seeing the 1920s, not a great time for a lot of people, but we see restrictive covenants being implemented in a lot of places. This is a map from 1947 that shows predominantly non-white areas, non-residential areas, and then areas with covenants. And so this was kind of the loophole from what I was talking about in 1917, and it really kicked in the 1920s of saying, okay, well, we can't zone for racism, so what we're going to do is say, well, it's my property right. And I guess, you know, it's kind of ironic now that I think about it. In 1926, we say, well, the government gets to choose how your property is used, and I guess they were turning a pretty blind eye on this one. So the real pivot, though, is in 1924. So the National Association of Realtors, and mind you, this is an American story, but this is a very Chicago story. The National Association of Realtors was based and created in Chicago. So in 1924, they added Article 34 that reads, a realtor should never be instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood a character of property or occupancy, members of any race or nationality, or any individuals whose presence will clearly be detrimental to property values in that neighborhood. This is the first time in history that racism is formalized in the housing market. Realtors are now actively gatekeepers, and segregation becomes market-based, value-neutral, and self-enforcing. Now, it can't get worse than this, right? Wrong. So, I just said that this is a very Chicago story, and I've gone on a lot of lectures about affordable housing. I've seen a lot of movies about it. I live it every day, and I never see this discussed. And I think this is really, really, really important to talk about. That the Federal Home Loan Bank, which I'll get into later, politicians, yes, they do write policy, but they rely on the expertise of academics. And those academics at the time who were normalizing social science were in Chicago. And so we have some of the culprits here that really helped inform, and I'll show you in a second, but I just want to show you some of the people. So Richard T. Eli here, he argued that segregation was inevitable, neighborhood decline followed social laws, and that, quote unquote, certain population destabilized property values. We have Frederick Morrison Babcock, who legitimized racial valuation when it came to evaluating real estate. He explicitly warned against the infiltration of black residents in inharmonious racial groups. We have H. Morton Bodfish, and he really institutionalized exclusion, which I'll get to in a second, but he really said that integration was financial risk. And okay, so I study economics at University of Chicago, and I would like to mention that all these people are Northwestern, okay? Okay? I know Chicago had some problematic academics later on, but when it came to racial housing policy, you know, there's one of us, unfortunately. There's Homer Hoyt, so you can't win them all. But Homer Hoyt, he was actually probably the worst. And so I guess make a dent where you can. But the reason why they're all so important was that in 1933, they helped Herbert Hoover create the Federal Home Loan Bank. And these social scientists were the authors that wrote the rules for who receives mortgages, who receives loans, and which borrowers represent risk. Now, when people think of maps and representing risk, what do we typically think of? We think of redlining. And this was the same year that this happened, because even though it's a new president with FDR now in charge, he uses the Federal Home Loan Bank to pass the Homeowners Loan Act, which creates the Homeowners Corporation, or HOLC. And so it was the policies and the research of Chicago academics that actually legitimized redlining for the rest of the nation here. They were the ones who defined what is risk and what is, who is eligible. And I keep on coming back to that. And I want you to think about that throughout this whole thing is who deserves housing? Because it's the academics who get to say, oh, well, this is the way the world should look. It's the policymakers who do it. And so I just want you to think about that. So same year, 1933, really big year, we see that FDR also passes the Housing Act, or the limited dividend programs solution. Now, this was really intended, this was kind of to get quasi-governmental developers to come in, and you see that they try to cap profits. It was government financing plus land assembly, and the real intention of these were to replace the slums. Now, they were pretty successful in replacing the slums, especially because most slums were demolished the decade earlier. But they really were not good in creating public housing. In all respects, this was kind of a failure of a program, and FDR recognized this. So that's why a couple years later, he created the seminal Housing Act of 1937. Now, this is kind of ground zero of public housing history in a lot of ways. This is when housing authorities were assigned. Oh, thank you. So you have housing authorities created across the country. So Chicago's is Chicago Housing Authority, and the deal was that the federal government would pay 90% of the cost, and cities would contribute the remaining 10%. And it was the government's responsibility, the local housing authority's responsibility, to continue to operate these buildings once they were developed. So I want you to think, who is worthy of these buildings? In 1937, we see, the same year that this was kicked off, you see all these buildings get built that are kind of representing family values. We have the Jane Addams homes, which is now the National Public Housing Museum. I highly recommend you checking it out. It's a fantastic museum. You have the Julius E. Lathrop homes. It's one of my biggest honors and privileges to be underwriting that deal right now. You have the Trumbull Park homes, and you have the Ida B. Wells homes. So in this time, we see that homes were built for, the nuclear family doesn't really come until the 1940s, 50s in terms of being used, but that's really what this was. It was for rewarding white families, and Ida B. Wells, which I think is very interesting. It's larger and was built later. That was predominantly for African Americans, but the first three were for white families. I think what's really interesting is the design of them, and I learned this at the National Public Housing Museum actually, was that there's courtyards inside of these homes, and the way they design them is that the kitchens are facing the courtyards, and the idea was so that the mother could be cleaning the dishes but also looking into the courtyard to see her kids play. And I want to illustrate this because it really shows you this idea of the woman being home, the kids playing, the father being at work. That was who deserved, to the government's perspective, housing. So how do I put this? So white flight happens, and I don't think the federal government really thought this through because they just spent so much money in creating housing authorities and public subsidies for rentals. And then they're realizing, oh my God, well, all the people we built this for are leaving. What do we do? So they could rent to black people, or they could subsidize home ownership instead. And so what you see here is the creation of the 30-year amortization that a lot of people use today on their mortgages. You see FHA mortgage insurance, the GI Bill home ownership. And so we see that the policy is really to prioritize home ownership in the 1930s and 40s, but that begs the question, well, what about public housing in cities? The answer was the elderly. The elderly were still deemed, quote unquote, particular worth in one of the papers that I read. And I think that this is really interesting because a lot of elderly, they couldn't just move to the suburbs and start families. And so you see a lot of housing being built for the elderly. Before I show you the next charts, here's a great graphic that kind of just shows you the drastic change right before So in the 1950s, we're starting to see white flight. And even by the 1960s, you see that CHA already becomes majority African American, but I'll get to that in a second. I spent a lot of time. I charted every single CHA property, and I tried to identify the density, the units, the year built, and it's given me a really good insight in analyzing this data. And there's a lot here to see. So on the right chart, it's really interesting. It's almost a direct correlation in the 1960s. You see family homes just flatline. There's really no more regard for building family homes in the 1960s. It's really slowed down to a halt. But you see seniors going up. And at the same time, look on the left, the orange line is low rises. You see that completely flat line, and you see high rises are basically the only kind of building types being built. And so I think a great example of this is Marina City versus the Hilliard homes. So these were both designed by the same architect, Bertrand Goldberg, within 2 years of each other, and yet they tell very different stories. So Marina City was built in 1964. This was the first major post-war urban high-rise in the United States, and it was really designed for people to come back into the city. They could walk to work. There was parking to really say, look, you don't have to worry about parking. You're bringing the suburbs into the city. You have your own boat dock if you have a boat. You have a movie theater. There's a skating rink. And so it was really to kind of impress lifestyle, this new urban living, which is completely radical in the 1960s. So 2 years later, you see the same architect designing the Hilliard homes, which actually is built on top of a brothel. And so you could see kind of, actually, you know what? Here's another fun fact about Chicago. So the brothel was the Everlay sisters, and if you've ever heard of the saying, get laid, that was actually in reference to going to the Everlay sisters brothel to get laid. To get ever laid, yeah. So, so they demolished that, but they created the Hilliard homes. And what I think is really important about this story is that the Hilliard homes, they tried. It was this way to mash up every CHA policy into one. They didn't know. They were really at a crossroads right now. You can tell it's kind of high rise, it's kind of mid rise. They built family homes and elderly homes here. They're experimenting with the scale and even the management. I think at a certain point, this is when the CHA police was getting started. So you're seeing that all these new experiments of what it means to be in public housing, and there's kind of a crossroads. Well, fortunately or unfortunately, the law kind of set the precedence for the next, I would argue even to this day, was Goutreau. So I can't emphasize how important Goutreau is to urban planning. When I studied geography in college, and it was learning about Goutreau actually that made me interested in urban planning, because Goutreau basically argued that segregation was state-created and intentional, and proved that segregation was occurring through public housing. And because of this, you had to be forced to, if you wanted to build public housing, you had to prove that you were not reinforcing segregation. And no housing authority knew how to prove this. And so what we really see is this experimentation, and there was this huge 20-long case study on scattered site housing, and this was kind of really the introduction, the major adoption of housing vouchers, and saying, well, if we're reinforcing segregation, well, how about we let people choose where they want to live and see what happens? And so even though the lawsuit was in 1966, there was a 2-decade-long case study following the lives of people who got to live where they wanted to live. And you see that the children are much better off when they're going to higher amenity areas. And to this day, CHA's main priority is exactly that. They want to prioritize building in places that have high amenities to deconcentrate poverty and deconcentrate segregation. So you really see this legitimized less than 10 years later with the Housing and Community Development Act of 1974. So President Gerald Ford limits the total development across the whole entire country of public housing to only 30,000 units over the next 6 years. And this is because it's basically going from a supply side strategy to a demand side strategy. Now we're saying instead of building, we're going to give them the golden tickets and they can choose where to live. So this is the time where, I don't want to pour this out, but this is kind of, this is the sad part of housing is the 1970s through the 90s. This is when we think of Cabrini Green, when we think of the Robert Taylor homes. Trust collapses. We see that public housing is seen as a failure. You're seeing crime narratives, and this coincides with the war on drugs, the fear of density. But I want to make a quick clarification here that the misconception that public housing collapsed because of poverty is deeply, deeply misstated. It's because it was fundamentally abandoned by the government that built the housing. The government stopped funding the construction. More importantly, they stopped funding the maintenance of the housing. And so these were really inevitable that they were going to collapse. And so we'll take a moment of silence for public housing here. Okay, 1986 comes. So basically, if you see here, if you look at the blue line here, the blue line is the total units. You basically see that it's kind of a trickle between the 1960s and 1980s. And then you see that sharp increase. That sharp increase is due to what is now known as the Low Income Housing Tax Credit, or LIHTC. LIHTC is the backbone of most affordable housing today. And it was created as this compromise to fit the Reagan's free market philosophy by replacing direct public housing with private investment, using tax reform to incentivize rather than mandate affordable housing. So most LIHTC projects in the city of Chicago actually were rehab in the early years, so the late 80s and the early 90s. But we do see some new construction, and because of the legacy of Goutreau, you could see that the housing was incredibly, incredibly low density. There was this trauma hearing about, well, if we build anything beyond 4 to 5 or 6 units, there might be another lawsuit. We don't want this. We want to prove that we can do scattered sites. And so, like I said, I live in Westtown, and these are some of the houses in Westtown that were built in the late 80s that were funded by LIHTC. So now we're entering the 90s here, and so the CHA, for many reasons, was basically a bust, and I can't emphasize how crazy of a time it was at CHA during the 90s. The entire board stepped down, and HUD had to take CHA over. So CHA actually handed the keys to HUD, and between 1995 and 1999, HUD actually had to operate CHA. And this was due to the severe physical deterioration, the federal funding collapse, extreme concentration of poverty. And so this was actually also really largely symbolic. We're entering a new millennium here, and there's this idea that this is really the time for us to completely start over. We can really set a precedent of what housing should look like for the 2000s. And so CHA gets the keys back in 1999, and one of the first major projects that they work on is the Henry Horner home. So you see here in 2000, the Henry Horner homes being demolished, and then a year later, you see them being replaced with what is now the Henry Horner homes. And you could see the radical difference in what was the priorities during the 1960s versus the priorities during the early 2000s. There's more conversations around mixed income communities. You have new urbanism really taking a big presence in the room of discussions in affordable housing and urban planning. And so we're starting to see that it's more now about deconcentrating poverty. And so that kind of leads us to today. So you see in the 2000s, the scattered site, And then just 10, 20 years later, we see a lot more mid-rise and some high-rise LIHTC. And this is really because it's the most economic to build. But I wanted to just kind of what I was talking about in the beginning about how policy reflects our values as a society. These are some of my favorite LIHTC financed properties in the city of Chicago. So on the top left in River North or Streeterville, Chicagoan State, you have the Lawson House. This used to be the regional YMCA headquarters for Chicago, and it now is single room occupancy for a lot of people at endangerment of homelessness. On the bottom left, you have the Concord at Sheridan. This is in Rogers Park. This is such a cool development where you have Target on the bottom and you have housing on top to kind of show. And the whole point of affordable housing is that a lot of you probably wouldn't even know that this is affordable housing. And that's kind of the whole point. We don't want you to know. I am a huge Costco fan. Whenever I drive on Damon, if you've seen those brick buildings next to the river, that's the Lathrop homes. Those are some of the first public housing projects in the nation, and they're right here in Chicago. They're going through their third and final major rehabilitation phase. On the bottom, you have the Foglia residences. This is the first LIHTC financed multifamily building in the country built for blind people. I think this is really cool that it's in the medical district in Chicago, and so it really capitalizes on the synergies of the medical district to help blind people access more doctor's appointments and live a safer and more dignified life. On the top right, you have Northtown Library, which is in Westridge. Fun fact, Westridge actually has more languages spoken in it than the United Nations. It's one of the most diverse neighborhoods in the country, if not the world. And this building really tries to show that. It really prioritizes immigrants. It's a library. It's a city library on the bottom floor, and it's apartments on top. And then finally, on the bottom right, you have Encuentro Square, which is the very, very western end of the 606. And it really highlights the kind of live, work, play model of being next to parks and bike lanes, and it's just such a beautiful piece of architecture. So today, I think CHA did a really good job of trying to distribute equally high rises, mid rises, and low rise. It's almost exactly a third today. We do see that the vast majority of CHA is actually CHA residents are mostly through vouchers. And so the average household size is 2. And what's also really interesting is that 83% of household incomes in CHA households are extremely low income. So to give you an idea, a family of 2 to 4 would be making $30,000 to $40,000 a year. So 84% of CHA today is African American. The lion's share, 76%, is female. And another third is they really do well in distributing age. So you have a third that's under 18, a third that's working age, and a third that's elderly. Now, one major misconception I do want to talk about is the third model. And now I'm getting a little more into the practitioner side than the history side here. But there's a difference between public housing and affordable housing, and I want to dispel this. Not all public housing is affordable housing. So first of all, there's lowercase affordable housing and capital A affordable housing. Capital affordable housing is when it's financed and there's restrictive covenants and there are guardrails that enforce that affordability. It's not naturally occurring. Now, public housing is when it's built and operated by a housing authority. Why this gets confusing oftentimes is basically all capital A affordable housing in Chicago is also has public housing units in them. And a big reason of this is because a lot of rental assistance is dominated by the CHA. Now, there are really, really small other forms of rental assistance. There's a Chicago Low-Income Housing Trust Fund. IDA has a Section 811, which is for special populations. But you really see that the vast majority of ability for rental assistance comes from the CHA. And I just wrote a paper basically saying how Chicago actually has one of the largest pools of funding that is not being used. It's actually incredible how much it can be deployed, and it's not currently being deployed. And that's a separate conversation. I think I need a couple more beers for that. But I guess what I want you to realize is these are all design choices. I think a lot of times you'll hear people say, oh, this is a legal requirement, You are the authority. You are the Chicago Housing Authority. When there's authorities, you have the jurisdiction to have these choices. And so, yes, I do want to acknowledge that, yeah, we have to abide by still, the Goutreau lawsuit, by the way, is still going on. They're just about finalizing the settlement today after almost 60 years. So there's this deep fear of doing something wrong and getting sued again. And we're still living through that every day. That is not over. But I do want to say that there is an opportunity to have publicly financed housing that doesn't necessarily have to use rental assistance from the federal government, although that's what's currently used. So the next misconception I want to talk about is that public housing is just in poor areas. If you aggregate every CHA unit with income band, there's a pretty strong correlation here that housing is correlated, that household income is correlated with CHA units. But this is a really dangerous narrative to talk about, because if you really wanted to make a causal argument, you need to analyze every census tract in the city. And when you do this, the correlation is almost exactly zero. And this changes the way that we look at it. And what we really see is that CHA has been prioritizing matching the city. And the reality is like, yeah, you could say the units are in a lot of poor areas, but hate to break it to you, most of Chicago is pretty poor, and that's why it looks like this. So a lot of the units are really in the poorer areas. And so, yeah, there's not a lot of units in the higher income areas, but it's also because there's less higher income areas to begin with. And there's such a priority to build in those higher income areas, and it's so hard to do that just because the land is so valuable, many reasons, but you don't see that. But you do see that the correlation is incredibly high for this. And then, I had the thought, well, maybe, this is projects, this is not units. So does it look different with units rather than properties? Not really. It's still a very high correlation. You see that most units really strongly reflect what Chicago looks like. And so this is a really important slide, because what this is showing here is that only 10 to 25% of census tracts even have CHA properties. So if we believe that public housing is everywhere in poor neighborhoods, it really becomes easy to blame it for neighborhood poverty. But the data shows that most poor neighborhoods actually don't contain public housing at all. In the paper I was talking about actually argue that, personally, I don't know, there's maybe a couple CHA people here, but I think that there should be a higher emphasis on building in poorer areas that need it rather than just focusing on higher income areas. If you look at where higher income areas are, there's barely any in the white in the north side. The island there is Cabrini Green. So we do see after the plan for transformation in 2000, you do see this wider dispersion to wealthier areas. And I think there's a lot of credit to be given. CHA's had a lot to deal with, and they did a pretty good job of doing that. I was curious of what the median income was pre and post 2000 built properties. So if a property was built before 2000, the average tract income is $46,000, whereas the average tract income for post 2000 is $61,000. So another misconception I want to talk about is that affordable housing is more expensive than market rate. This is a cartoon that was in the Chicago Tribune. The building says Chicago low-cost housing. And King Kong here says government waste and says, hi, Rumi. I think that this is a really dangerous narrative to peddle, and we constantly see in the affordable housing world these headlines, $700,000 per unit, $800,000 per unit. Soon we're going to see a $900,000 per unit, or maybe even $1 million per unit, who knows? But why is this? Well, there's a lot of actual barriers to affordable housing. There's time, there's labor standards, there's financing complexity, compliance, political instability, land use, political and community pushback. But I want to emphasize this. Affordable housing is building something that the market won't build. And you can't factor that in market rate housing. You're not factoring in the social services coordinators. You're not factoring in all the labor standards that have to be built or the political and community pushback. I'm not going to name the city, but I'm dealing with one in a Chicago suburb right now where the municipality basically says we don't want 30% area median income units in our community. And this is not coming from the residents. This is coming from the government itself. This is an issue that we see time and time again throughout Chicago and throughout the country. And every time we delay housing, you still have to pay the lawyers. You still have to pay insurance. You still have to pay the taxes. And so these costs add up. And so when you're having projects that are lasting 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years, that makes the cost of the housing a lot more expensive. And there's a lot of hidden costs. We are such a specialized industry where we have our own investors and our own lawyers and our own managers and our own compliance officers. And you have all these specialized skill sets that you can't just bring someone who's never done affordable housing and apply their skill set. And so this also adds a lot of costs. So as I mentioned before, we're basically living in a legacy of 1920s Chicago. Land use was essentially frozen in the 1920s, and we still see that 70% of the city is still single-family zoned. So I want to end with this slide here. How am I doing on time? I don't know. Okay, good. You have all these conversations that going around, and these are some that I've heard, is that public housing is old, or it's dirty, it's unsafe, it's expensive, and the list goes on and on and on. But I want you to remember that policy isn't just about how it affects people, or in this case, buildings. It's about the values that we choose as a government and as a people to implement into our built and social environments. So I'm going to turn back to my first slide. When I'm watching the Olympics, when I'm watching the Oscars, when I'm watching the Super Bowl, I'm thinking, how is America representing itself? And I am very critical, as you can see, of American policy, but I'm also very proud of how far we've come. And I want you to be empowered to say that you do have a voice and you do have power in shaping the built environment that we all live in today. So with that, I'd like to say thank you.